Hi, this is Matt Baker. The United States has a new president. Well, sort of. For only the second time in U.S. history, a previous president is president once again. I therefore thought it would be a good time to update my timeline of U.S. history chart. But not only have I added the 47th president, I've actually done a complete redesign of the poster with the help of fellow YouTuber Mr. Beat, whose specialty is U.S. history. If you want to get a copy of the new poster, which is available in 2 sizes, just head over to usefulcharts.com or use the link in the description or pinned comment. So in today's video, I'm going to go through the entire chart in detail and basically cover the entire history of the United States, showing you how its territory changed over time to become what it is today. Let's start here at the bottom with the map of the US as it exists today. As most people know, the United States currently consists of 50 individual states. But this was not always the case, which is why I've used different colors for different groups of states. On the East Coast are the 13 original states, shown in dark red. However, in 1783, which is when the American Revolutionary War officially ended, this is not actually what those 13 original states looked like. You see, several of them were actually larger than they are now, and therefore the original map of the United States actually looked like this. However, over time, several new states were carved out of lands that had originally been claimed by one or more of the 13 original states. On my chart, I've shown these additional states in light red. I chose red for both these groups because prior to independence, these areas had been British. And on the timeline portion of the chart, red always stands for either England or Great Britain. To the west of the Mississippi, we get a large chunk of states shown in dark blue. This area represents the country's first major expansion, known as the Louisiana Purchase. Although take note that the exact borders of the purchase were slightly different. I chose dark blue for these states because originally this whole area was claimed by France, and on the timeline portion of the chart, dark blue stands for France. We then get several southern states shown in either yellow or gold. These areas were originally claimed by Spain, and in the case of the gold states, they were later a part of Mexico. As you can probably guess, I chose these colors because, on the timeline, yellow stands for Spain and gold for Mexico. Finally, in the Northwest, there are 3 states shown in green, which were once known as Oregon country, as well as Alaska and Hawaii shown in pink. Now, at this point, let's go all the way up to the top and look at this key here. You already know that blue stands for France, red for England, and yellow for Spain. Well, take note that you're also going to see a bit of orange on the timeline, which stands for the Dutch, as well as purple, which stands for Indigenous Americans. Which brings me to the map at the very top, which represents what the situation on the continent looked like around the time of European arrival, when the land was inhabited solely by Indigenous Americans. Now, keep in mind that this map is extremely simplified and only shows a few dozen out of the hundreds of distinct indigenous groups that existed at the time, most of which survive to this day. Keep in mind also that the ancestral homelands shown on the map are approximate, especially in the West, because by the time the white man reached that area, local migration westward had already taken place. Now, out of the 36 indigenous groups shown on this map, I've selected 4 to place on the timeline itself: the Navajo, Sioux, Cherokee, and Iroquois. Again, this is an overly simplified way of doing things, but my hope is that by highlighting these 4, each from a different part of the continent, you can get a general idea of what happened to Indigenous Americans post-colonialism. Okay, let's now start at the top of the timeline, which, as you can see, starts in the year 1630. By this point, there was already an English colony in Virginia, a Dutch colony in what is today New York, and several more English colonies in New England. To the south, there were also Spanish colonies in both Florida and New Mexico. Again, In 1630, all of these colonies already existed. So how can we find out which one was first? Well, I figured you might want to know that, which is why I included this little sidebar over here, listing several notable settlements established before 1630. I started with two very important indigenous settlements. Cahokia in Illinois, which had a population of 20,000 all the way back in the year 600, and Pueblo Bonito in New Mexico, which is famous for its multi-story homes, dating to around the year 1000. So yeah, if you thought there were no cities prior to European arrival, you were wrong. The rest of the list focuses on the earliest European settlements, including those that failed, such as the Spanish settlement of San Miguel de Guadalupe, the absolute earliest attempt at a settlement by a European power in what is today the United States. That was way back in 1526, and we don't even know the exact location. The first successful settlement didn't occur until 1565, again by the Spanish, this time at St. Augustine, Florida. The French also made some early attempts, one at Charles Fort, South Carolina, and another on St. Croix Island, Maine. However, both of these failed, and France's first successful settlement ended up being outside of what is now the US, in Quebec City, Canada. It's not shown on this chart because this chart only shows areas that eventually became part of the US. But what about England? Well, you're probably familiar with Jamestown, Virginia, England's first foothold on the continent, established in 1607. However, prior to this, there was actually a failed attempt on Roanoke Island in North Carolina. About 100 people settled there in 1585, but when a ship visited 5 years later, there was no trace of anyone, and to this day, no one knows exactly what happened. England's second successful settlement was the one founded by the Pilgrims, who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620 aboard the Mayflower. Finally, around the same time and in the same general area, the Dutch also arrived, and they established successful settlements, first at Fort Nassau in what is today Albany, New York, as well as New Amsterdam, which we now know as New York City. Okay, let's now move over to the timeline and look at how things continue to evolve along the Atlantic coast. Take note that from the very beginning, the English colonies in the South, starting with Virginia, were very much separate from New England. In between them was New Netherland, and for a brief period, New Sweden, in what is today Delaware. But that was fairly quickly conquered by the Dutch. In the South, Virginia was joined by the province of Maryland, which was granted for Catholic settlement, and in the North, all kinds of new colonies were established. The ones at New Haven and Saybrook eventually merged with the one at Connecticut River, and together they became known simply as Connecticut. The one at Rhode Island, however, remained separate, which is why Rhode Island today is the smallest of the 50 states. Also, take note that for most of the 1600s, Plymouth was actually a separate colony from Massachusetts, although eventually the two would merge. New Hampshire also joined Massachusetts for a while, but then eventually became independent again. This purple line over here represents the Iroquois, who lived near New England, and were actually a confederacy of 5, later 6, nations. Although, take note that the name they used for themselves was actually Haudenosaunee. Their traditional enemies to the north were the Wyandot. So, after the Europeans arrived, a new conflict developed between the two groups called the Beaver Wars over who would dominate the fur trade. The Haudenosaunee allied with the Dutch, and later the British, whereas the Wyandot allied with the French. In the end, it was the Haudenosaunee who were victorious. Another major event in the early colonial period was the conquest of New Netherland by England, which is when New Amsterdam became New York. New Jersey had originally been Dutch territory as well, but when the English took it over, it became its own province, and for a few decades, 2 provinces, East and West. Then, in 1681, another important colony was established, Pennsylvania, named after William Penn, who was a Quaker. Around the same time, all of the colonies in the north were merged into a single dominion called New England. But that didn't last, and pretty soon they were back to being individual colonies. In the South, Carolina eventually split off from Virginia, and then it was split into two separate provinces. Delaware split off from Pennsylvania, and then finally, Georgia was added as well. Therefore, by the time we get to the 1770s, there were a total of 13 colonies, 5 in the South, 4 in the middle, and 4 in New England. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we move on, let me go back and point out the 4 major wars that occurred between the British colonies and France during the colonial period, all of which coincided with major wars occurring in Europe. By this point, the French not only claimed Canada to the north, but also the entire Mississippi Valley, which they called Louisiana after their king Louis XIV, plus Illinois country. That's this area here. Anyhow, the first 3 of the 4 colonial wars were named after whoever the British monarch was at the time. So the first was called King William's War. Territory-wise, not much changed because of this war, but I'll point out that it was during this war that the infamous Salem witch trials took place in Massachusetts. Next came Queen Anne's War. This time, England, now part of Great Britain, made significant gains at the expense of the French, mostly in areas that are now a part of Canada. The third was King George's War, and again, it saw the British making significant gains against the French, mostly in Canada. But it was the final colonial war, known as the French and Indian War, that ended up being the most important for the soon-to-be United States. It saw the entirety of New France falling to the British, with most of Louisiana going to Spain and Illinois country going to Great Britain. Initially, Illinois country was set aside as an Indian reserve, but then later it was added to the province of Quebec, although Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, and Virginia all had claims there as well. Finally, before I talk about the American Revolution, I want to address the transatlantic slave trade and race-based slavery, which in terms of U.S. territory began in 1619 and continued long past independence, all the way to 1865. During this time, a total of 460,000 Africans were captured, enslaved, and brought over to the colonies or states. On top of this, an additional 8.5 million individuals of African descent were born into slavery in either the colonies or the states themselves. So this big line here represents this sad but very important part of American history, which must never be forgotten. Okay, we've now come to the big event, the American Revolution, which is when the 13 colonies went from being British colonies to being a single independent country known as the United States. Now, there were many things that led up to the revolution, too many to go through in a short summary like this. So let me just say that basically the colonies had gotten used to making a lot of their own decisions and even fighting their own battles. And therefore, when Britain suddenly started to exert more control through new taxes and a permanent military presence, the Americans decided that they had had enough. In 1775, hostilities broke out between local militia groups in Massachusetts and the British soldiers stationed there. Soon thereafter, a Continental Army was formed, led by George Washington. And then in 1776, delegates from each colony got together to make an official Declaration of Independence. Next, in 1777, the delegates, aka Congress, produced a temporary governing document called the Articles of Confederation. But independence didn't come right away. It had to be fought for, and it wasn't until 1783 that Great Britain finally gave in and recognized that the United States was now an independent country. However, it wasn't until 1789 that George Washington became the first president. So, who was in charge until then? Well, basically, Congress was. And they had a lot of work to do, such as coming up with a new permanent constitution. Each of the 13 states had to get on board with it, and this took time. On the chart, you can see that each state has a star with a number in it. Well, that number represents the order in which each state officially joined the Union. So out of the original 13, Delaware was first and Rhode Island was last. Vermont, which became the 14th state, is an interesting case. It had never actually been its own colony, but instead was claimed by both New York and New Hampshire. Well, when the Revolution broke out, they surprised everyone by declaring themselves to be their own independent republic. This, however, didn't last long, and after getting permission from New York, they ended up joining the US in 1791. Another interesting case is the almost state of Franklin, which at the time was a part of North Carolina. They tried to become an official state under the Articles of Confederation, but they failed, although eventually the western part of North Carolina did become its own state, called Tennessee, just like the western part of Virginia, which became Kentucky. Thus, by the year 1800, the US was comprised of 16 states. But what about the Haudenosaunee, aka the Iroquois, who controlled a lot of land and had been major players up to this point? Well, they mostly allied with the British during the Revolution, so they were not left in a good bargaining position. In 1794, their leaders signed the Treaty of Canandaigua with the United States, agreeing to a perpetual peace and friendship based on certain promises, most of which were eventually broken. Let me now address the term Founding Fathers, which comes up a lot when people talk about U.S. history. Basically, the term can include any of the original delegates to Congress, and in particular, those who signed the Declaration of Independence. However, out of all these men, it has been argued that 7 were the most important. 4 of these went on to serve as U.S. presidents: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, and James Madison, the primary author of the Constitution. But there was also Benjamin Franklin, America's most senior diplomat at the time of independence, John Jay, the first Chief Justice, and Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary. Now, something else I should point out is that Washington, D.C. was not the original capital of the United States. It was actually built after independence as a made-to-order capital city, located in a special federal district so that it would not belong to any one state. That district is located between Virginia and Maryland, which is why I show it as a circle here. So what was the capital before Washington? Well, it moved around quite a bit, but most of the time it was in Philadelphia. Now, before I move on, let me point out that Alabama and Mississippi were eventually formed out of lands once claimed by Georgia. And Maine, which had originally been a part of Massachusetts, became its own state in 1820. Okay, remember Illinois country, which had once been a part of French Louisiana? Well, it was ceded to the US by Great Britain at the end of the Revolutionary War. But at that point, it wasn't clear which state it would be assigned to. Previously, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, and Virginia all had claims there. But one by one, they agreed to give these up. And in 1787, the whole thing was designated as a special area called the Northwest Territory. Eventually, 5 new states would be formed out of it, the first being Ohio. The rest was split into Indiana Territory and Michigan Territory, with Indiana Territory eventually becoming Indiana and Illinois, and Michigan Territory eventually becoming Michigan and Wisconsin. Let's next look at the Louisiana Purchase, which was acquired from France in 1803. But wait, didn't I say that most of Louisiana had been given to Spain after the fall of New France? Well, yes, it had. But in 1801, Napoleon secretly made a deal with Spain and got it back, only to then, 2 years later, sell it to the United States. But here's the important thing to realize. In 1803, the vast majority of people living in the Louisiana Purchase area were not French or Spanish, but rather indigenous. Which is why, after the first 3 states were carved out of the territory, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Missouri, the remaining area was simply called Indian Territory. And what happened to Indian Territory? Well, step by step, it got smaller and smaller, starting with the additions of Iowa and Minnesota. And sadly, several indigenous groups from the southeast, such as the Cherokee, were forced to relocate to Indian Territory in what's known as the Trail of Tears. But before we continue with what happened to Indian Territory, I want to go all the way back to the top of the chart and talk about the areas of the US that started out as Spanish colonies. So while the core parts of New Spain were located in what is now Mexico, it also very early on included Florida and what is now the US state of New Mexico. Then, quite a bit later, in 1718, Texas was founded, although it was initially called New Philippines. Then finally, in 1767, California was settled as well, although it was initially called the Californias, plural, because there is actually both an Alto, or Upper California, which is now the American state, as well as Baja California, which is this peninsula here, now a part of Mexico. I'll also point out that in 1763, at the end of the French and Indian War, Britain actually acquired Florida for a while, which at that point was divided into West Florida and East Florida. But then Spain got it back before finally ceding it to the US in 1819. Now, just like the 13 British colonies eventually achieved independence and became their own country, so did the Spanish colonies. They became Mexico in 1821. Originally, Mexico was huge, but after just 2 years, it lost Central America. And then about a decade later, it lost Texas. You see, by this point, Texas had a lot of American settlers. They eventually revolted against Mexico and in 1836 declared themselves to be their own independent republic. This lasted for 12 years, after which time they opted to join the US as the 28th state. That same year, a war between Mexico and the US ended, in which Mexico was forced to cede Upper California as well as everything north of the Gila River. But this was not actually the moment when the US finally stretched from sea to sea for the first time. That actually occurred 2 years earlier, in 1846, when the US signed the Oregon Treaty with Great Britain, which split Oregon country at the 49th parallel. Okay, we're now going to move back to the eastern side of the chart because we're about to talk about the most deadly war to occur on US soil, the Civil War, which, despite what some lost causers say, was all about slavery. You see, within the first few decades after independence, all of the northern states abolished slavery, but it continued in the South. The border between the free states and the slave states basically ended up being the southern border of Pennsylvania, which had also been the main part of the Mason-Dixon line, which is why the South is sometimes called Dixieland. But you see, as the US expanded west, there was debate over whether new states would allow slavery or not. When the anti-slavery candidate Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, most of the southern states left the Union to form their own country, known as the Confederate States of America. This part of the chart here shows which states left and which states stayed. Of special note is West Virginia, which split off from the Confederate state of Virginia in the middle of the war in order to join the North. Of course, the North won the war, meaning that the United States stayed united. Let's now return to the so-called Wild West, where Indian Territory was now being carved up into a bunch of smaller territories and new states, including Dakota Territory, named after the Dakota tribe, which, together with the Lakota, made up the indigenous group known as the Sioux. The Sioux were one of the last indigenous groups to fight to the bitter end against the Americans, who were encroaching on their land. They won several key battles, such as the one involving Custer's last stand. But in the end, the Americans were victorious, and the Sioux were forced onto reservations. Over in what had previously been Mexican territory, another major indigenous group met a slightly different fate. The Navajo tried to make peace with the Americans rather than fight them. But in the end, they were forced to leave their ancestral lands and relocate to a reservation in an event known as the Long Walk of the Navajo. The last 10 states to become a part of the continental U.S. were all formed between 1889 and 1912. The final 3 being Oklahoma, which was the last remaining piece of Indian territory, and to this day is home to 39 distinct nations, and then finally Arizona and New Mexico. So it was in 1912 that the continental U.S. finally looked like this, and there have been no major changes since then. But what about Alaska and Hawaii, the 49th and 50th states, both added in 1959? Well, this map here shows the various indigenous Alaskan groups, all of whom still have significant populations in the same areas today. And then we see here that the first European power to lay claim to Alaska was actually Russia, although it didn't actually build a colony there until 1784. Around the same time, the existence of the Hawaiian Islands became known to Europeans for the first time, but rather than it being colonized, a local ruler unified all the islands in 1795 and established the indigenous Kingdom of Hawaii. But then in 1867, the US bought Alaska from the Russians, and in 1893, there was a coup in Hawaii led by US settlers. That eventually led to the islands being annexed by the US in 1898. Now, to this day, in addition to its 50 states, the US still has several territories, all located off of the continent. The most important of these, because of its substantial population, is Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. It was acquired in 1898 at the end of the Spanish-American War, but has ever since remained a territory, even though there is occasionally talk of it obtaining statehood. At the same time, the US came to control the Philippines over in Asia, but following World War II, the US supported the Philippines in becoming independent. Thus, the only other populated territories held by the US are currently Guam, American Samoa, the US Virgin Islands, and the North Mariana Islands. Now, the final thing I want to highlight on this chart is this section over here, which lists the US presidents, color-coded by party affiliation. Take note also that these squares here indicate which party controlled the House of Representatives as well as the Senate. Nowadays, of course, the two main parties are the Republicans, shown in red, and the Democrats, shown in blue. But prior to the Civil War, there were actually some different parties. Initially, during what's now called the First Party System, the two main parties were the Federalists, shown in gray, and the Democratic Republicans, shown in green. Then, during the Second Party System, it was the Whigs, shown in yellow, versus the Democrats, shown in blue. If you're interested in learning more about the various party systems, I actually did a video on that last year, which I'll link to in the description. Now, there is obviously a lot on this chart that I didn't talk about, namely all of these individual events listed here alongside the dates. So if you want to learn more about US history, I suggest you do two things. First, get yourself a copy of this chart over at usefulcharts.com so that you have a good reference tool for grasping the overall scheme of things. But second, I suggest that you subscribe to Mr. Beat, who has lots of great videos on individual topics relating to US history. I'll leave a link to his channel in the description. Thanks for watching.